We don't know exactly how many students have dyslexia, but we know that it's quite a few. And as teachers, we have worked with a lot of students who struggled with reading and writing. So in this episode, I cannot wait to dive deeper into some strategies that we can use to help our dyslexic writers, especially because many of them are below grade level, and we're trying to teach on grade level lessons. I was lucky enough to talk to Heather O'Donnell during this episode, and she actually runs new Paltz Multisensory, where she works with families of students who have dyslexia, and she's a former classroom teacher, so she provided some great insight into ways that we can really support these students. Hi, Heather. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, April. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on to talk about how we can support our dyslexic learners, because we know that we have so many students with dyslexia, and I knew as a teacher, I really struggled to understand how to help support these students, especially when it comes to writing. So I'm really glad that you're here with us today.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. And yes, I agree. Classroom teachers do a lot. And when you have needs such as dyslexia on top of the needs of managing a classroom, it can be a challenge.
Yeah, that's for sure. So can you start by giving us just a general overview of what dyslexia is and how it typically affects learners in the classroom setting?
Sure. So dyslexia is a learning disability that affects a student's ability to learn how to read, write, and spell. In general, it's we don't think of it so much this way, but when we read, we're actually incorporating the sounds of the letters that we're looking at, and we're taking those sounds and translating them into words. So dyslexia is someone who has difficulty interpreting those sounds and turning them into words because due to brain scans and things like that, we actually know they're using different parts of their brain. So they need an explicit diagnostic instruction to learn how to coordinate the sounds that they're seeing that are associated with the letters, and so that they can read words fluently and use those words in writing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know the statistics aren't really accurate because there's a lot of students and adults with undiagnosed dyslexia, but it's a pretty large percentage when you're looking at learning disabilities overall of our student population.
Yes, totally. I don't remember the source of the statistic I saw, but something like 72% of IEPs in the United States are for learning disabilities, namely dyslexia. It's a large population of people who struggle with it. And like you said, many people don't even know that they struggle with it. They might not have a diagnosis. They just know that spelling is really hard or reading is really hard for them, and they tend to avoid those activities even as adults.
Yeah, so we have a family member that comes from that generation where we just kind of ignored a lot of learning disabilities and was just told that he was dumb his whole life. And so we very much suspect that is the cause of it. Now that we have a child with dyslexia, knowing that it runs in families. And so I think it's great that we're finally calling attention to it, and we're making sure that students get the help that they need, because these are very smart kids. It's just that they need different strategies for reading and writing.
Yes. When I meet with a new prospective client for my practice, one of the questions I always ask is there someone else in the family that's had difficulty learning to read, difficulty with spelling? And invariably the answer is, oh, yes, grandma, my cousin, uncle, aunt, dad, mom. It definitely has a genetic family link. And as people are learning about that and understanding that, and as parents are understanding that, it helps parents be a little bit more aware that maybe their child's difficulties might just need a little bit more explicit instruction and might need a few interventions. They're not necessarily going to get better on their own.
Speaking of that, can you go over a little bit more about Orton-Gillingham approach? Because I know that a lot of teachers have not been trained in that, but they've heard about it. And so they're probably wondering how they can use that in the classroom, maybe not necessarily by having to pay a lot of money for a training.
Yes, definitely. I think overall, this is a really exciting time because I think the science of reading is increasing in awareness, and that while the science of reading is not necessarily equal to the Orton-Gillingham approach, the two are strongly linked. And as a professional who has worked in this field for a while now, it's really nice to see people asking questions and thinking, how can I bring this into my classroom? Like you said, even without going through the formal training, what can I bring in to help my students do better? Orton-Gillingham is really an explicit way to teach phonics to students who need more direct instruction than perhaps other methods of reading instruction. So, a person who's teaching a student, according to Orton-Gillingham, is going to follow scope and sequence. Well, let me take that back. First, they're going to assess a student. They're going to see what the student knows and what the student needs to learn. Then they're going to take the results of that assessment and they're going to apply their scope and sequence and step by step teach them the letter knowledge and skills that the assessment showed the student is missing out on. And it's not a quick fix. I tell that to prospective clients all the time. This is not something you can do in 3 weeks and be done. But through explicit diagnostic instruction, here's a digraph. A digraph is 2 letters stuck together to make one sound. That's usually the definition I use with kids because they like the sticking together. We're going to read words that contain digraphs. We're going to spell words that contain digraphs. We're going to write sentences that contain words that have digraphs. We're going to read a decodable text that gives us a chance to practice the digraph we're working on. I like to describe it to clients as a layer cake. Each layer is going to be added step by step, and then it's not going to be too hard, unlike uncontrolled text. For a student with dyslexia who struggles with sounds and reading, the standard storybook has so many untaught concepts that, they're not going to necessarily be able to figure out without someone teaching them, this word has a digraph. Oh, this word is a contraction. This word has this syllable type. And I think, as teachers are becoming more aware of what can I explicitly teach my students, when I do that beginning of the year assessments and I see this student is missing this, what tool, how can I pull this child into a group with other kids who are missing that so that I can teach them that piece that they're missing. I love seeing these kinds of questions and dialogues starting to happen on a larger scale than simply Orton-Gillingham tutors on their own outside of school. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between the dyslexia tutors and the classroom teachers because I see that in the group. Everyone wants to learn more about how to help their students learn to read, which is amazing. And I feel like as teachers, we just felt like the kids had so many gaps and it was really hard to catch up. And now we have this knowledge of some strategies we can use, like you said, pulling them into a small group based off of the skill that they need. So we're just focusing on that skill. And that's really powerful. So how would you say the multisensory approach really plays a role in that? Because I know we have the explicit direction, but let's talk a little more about that multisensory approach that goes along with Orton-Gillingham that really helps our students with dyslexia.
Yeah, so I think the biggest piece is that we really, while we're explicitly teaching, we want students to engage with what they're learning. So for example, if they're spelling and they're tapping out the sounds in a word, we're going to tap out the sounds, then we're going to name the letter sounds, and then we're going to write the word while we're saying those letter sounds. That kind of repetition helps the knowledge and helps build that connection between the sounds and the word that they're writing. And again, kids with dyslexia need many more repetitions than a kid without dyslexia. So a kid without dyslexia might be able to write at, C-A-T, C-A-T, and get it, or what we call orthographically map the word so that they don't have to go sound by sound. They can just see that word and know it's cat. They might get that in 3 or 4 repetitions, but a child with dyslexia, it might take longer. So it's important to pace instruction. It's important to give students that practice, and it can be really fun. You can pull down cotton ball, I like to have kids write in shaving cream. We can spell words in shaving cream. Some kids don't love that sensory, but others are all in. And it's a great way to make simply, let's say the sound, let's say the letter, a little bit more fun. I use a lot of target erasers, those mini target erasers when I'm working with students, and we pull down the sounds with the erasers. Or poker chips. That's always a fun conversation when kids go home talking about poker chips. I always explain it to parents. But, you can use materials to make the process engaging, even if you're just going through the same sequence of say the sounds, say the letters, write it while you're saying the letters. That's necessary to build that bridge for the student to take that knowledge and make it so that after a while, the word is mapped and we don't have to go sound to sound. We can look at cat and know it says cat, not because we've memorized it, but because we've gone through enough of that sound writing sequence that the word is just banked.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are concerned with direct phonics instruction that it's very boring and repetitive. And the students will think that as well, unless you're using some of these multisensory activities. We were just the other day doing word mapping where they roll the dice and then they see the picture and then they map out the word, or they tap and then they write. So with that, it's essentially the same thing, right, as doing dictation. But what they're doing is they're rolling a dice, and it just makes a big difference to have that. And the shaving cream is great. I know I have a group that just loves the sand. The writing sand, it drives me crazy because it gets everywhere, but it's like their favorite. And then, there's just so many manipulatives that can make it so much fun. And it is essentially the same thing, but they're even skywriting is helpful. So there's just so many different strategies out there. And so I love that there are a lot of different options, and it's just a matter of kind of switching those up every once in a while and keeping the kids engaged.
Yes, definitely.
So how can teachers really integrate those multisensory approaches into their daily teaching practices? Let's say if they're not giving phonics lessons, like maybe they're in the older grades, how could they support those students and incorporate that into their lessons when, they're kind of past that phonics stage?
Well, I think as students get older, then you don't necessarily focus so much on the phonics as you pivot into the morphology. Where do the words come from? So we're starting, as a student moves through elementary school, we start to look at words with prefixes and bases and suffixes. One of my favorite ways to begin morphology with a student is with rupt. So you can get into words like disrupt, because rupt means to break, and it's an easy tie-in because you can talk about volcanoes. What does a volcano do? A volcano erupts, and then we can talk about how needs come out of, and disrupt means to interrupt, and you can go into all these words, and then you can add the suffix on the end, shun, interruption, disruption, and you start building these words. I like to call them Lego words, and that goes even better if you actually have Legos, because then kids can start to really get into it. So I think teachers of older students like that, as you're doing a read aloud, or as you have centers and book groups and kids reading text, if you pull one or two of those words out and you look at a whole group and as part of your morning meeting or word work or however you structure your literacy block, getting into that morphology and breaking apart those words and the prefixes and the bases. The great news is words that come from the Latin are very decodable once the pieces are taught. And that will help students as they head into middle school and high school when, again, I don't remember where I saw the statistic, but up to 60% of the words they're going to encounter are Latin-based. And so therefore giving them the tools to find the meaning that even if you don't know what interruption means, if you know rupt means break, you can you have a bit more of a head start than if you just read the word in the context of a sentence. So, I work with kids with morphology one-to-one, but I would imagine bringing it into the whole group could be a lot of fun. Perhaps scary at first, but the best part about the Orton-Gillingham approach is you really look into where words come from in a way that I know I didn't learn at all when I was learning to read. These words come from, England or Saxon. These words come from France. Who knew this stuff? I find it fascinating. Sometimes I think I find it more fascinating than my clients do. But, I think as a classroom teacher, bringing in some of this can be a lot of fun. And you can tie in history and you can tie in social studies. So hopefully that will give classroom teachers a little bit of an idea where they might be able to start.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I agree. I do find this stuff more interesting than other people as well. And so I could relate. And I found the Orton-Gillingham training to be so eye-opening because even in my teacher preparation program, we didn't learn any of that. And as a kid, I have very little phonics instruction and was lucky enough to be a child that picked it up easily. And so learning all of this right now, I like to get really nerdy about it, anything literacy related. So I think that's the purpose behind this podcast probably is letting me get it out so my husband doesn't have to keep hearing about it every day. And my kids are actually really into it because we talk a lot about what I'm doing in literacy as it relates to their schoolwork because they're third graders, which morphology is really where they're at right now.
Yeah.
We're still working on some of the phonics, but the morphology is really at their grade level that they're really starting to break down words and they get so excited when they learn a new one. So So what are some common challenges that teachers might face when they're trying to implement any sort of Orton-Gillingham approach in the classroom, and how can they overcome those?
I mean, I think like anything, if it's new to you, it can be a little scary. I think if you are trying to move in this direction in a school environment that perhaps is not yet there with you, and you're trying to like stick your toe in, and that can also be a little scary. I think you have to find a resource, or like either a book or a person. I know if you're a social media person, there's lots of people who are now like out there doing all the things. Like obviously you want to choose someone that might be able to help you in a way that you want someone certified or with a background and lots of training and things like that. I think it's easy to, if you wade into the social media world, it can get a little noisy. But I think, picking one, if it were me and I was starting down this road before I had training, I would pick one aspect of my classroom literacy block, and I would start there, like maybe something whole group, like we were talking about with the morphology. Like, okay, I'm going to at least 2 days a week, we're going to analyze a word, break it into the parts. What's the prefix? What's the suffix? And what's its origin? Where did it come from? And then when that started to feel more comfortable, then I might say, okay, I would look at the assessment of my kids in the beginning of the year and say, oh, these students really need these skills. I'm going to put them into a group, and, I'm going to pull them and make sure I'm working with them, once or twice a week, and really targeting those skills. And, I think as teachers get into what is the data telling me, and then what can I do to improve the student outcome according to that data, piece by piece instead of all at once, I think it becomes a little bit more manageable than to simply try to take it all in at once, because there is so much noise about it. There are so many people talking about it. It can seem overwhelming.
Yes, I agree. Knowing where to start is a concern. And then also knowing where to find the materials and the training. And a lot of teachers are being provided that, which is great, while others are just trying to do their best. So I think you're right. As far as finding a mentor is really helpful. And that could be someone on social media, because maybe you're not getting the training from somebody who is well trained. But like you said, be very aware of what that person's background is. And usually they'll list that in their profile, or they'll have a LinkedIn profile, and you can really see that they, have that master's in literacy, and they've done all the training, and they've worked in the classroom. They've been a reading interventionist, or they've been a special education teacher. And so you can really see that they have that background. And there are a few people that I think are fantastic in this space. So I'm glad for social media for that reason, because I think that has really improved our teaching in so many ways. Of course, there's some negative aspects of it for teachers, but that one on its own right now with science and reading is very helpful, and writing too, because that's where I'm trying to really get that word out about writing, which is such an important part of the literacy block.
No, I agree. And I too, I love teaching writing, and I feel like writing is sort of the forgotten child of the literacy block, and all the research is really showing that we can't write about things we don't understand. So if, it's all linked, you have to be able to decode to understand and improve your comprehension. But then you can't write about something unless you understand it. So that's like the next level. And the three kind of go together. So it's also exciting to see more research and more talking about writing in, I don't even know, like this last 6 months, last year, than I've noticed in the past 5 years. So good things are happening on the literacy front, I think.
I agree. And I think there may be some few listeners who were listening to the episode saying, this is about reading. You're talking about decoding and talking about Orton-Gillingham. But a lot of what we've been talking about with the phonics and the morphology, a lot of that goes into that spelling portion. And that is that bridge between reading and writing. So I'm really glad that we talked about all of that. And it is very much related to writing.
Listen.
So let's get into something that's a little bit of a hot button topic. So a lot of people have opinions here, but let's talk about assistive technology when we're working with dyslexic students who are writing, because there's definitely a lot of back and forth on about, should we be allowing them to use this technology? Should we not have them use any, and because we don't want them to be dependent on those tools. So if you want to share your opinion on this and maybe some tools that you use with your clients, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I had to stop and think of, I was like, oh, I got to think about this one. So I tend, obviously I work with students. I tend not to use a whole lot of apps and things like that. I know there are some out there. Nessie is, I believe, one that I know I often hear from families on consults and things like that. But I will totally cop to being old school. And I really feel that as much as possible, if I'm working with a student, I have no problem if a parent wants to supplement with an app, but really I'm just focused on what we can do together. For me, it's most important to try to help increase the awareness of classroom teachers, because, when I see a student once or twice a week, it's not enough. Classroom teacher, that's why I'm so excited to see the interest in multisensory reading, Orton-Gillingham, the science of reading happening in classrooms, because ultimately that's where, it needs to be. I do think it's really important to teach kids to type, especially kids with dyslexia, because I think that helps, many of my students really struggle with the handwriting piece. In my area, handwriting has not been very well taught, let's say, not through any fault of the teachers, but training has not necessarily been provided through schools. It's not deemed as important as other things historically in the past. And again, the research is really showing that handwriting is super, super important, and things are maybe starting to shift, but we are where we are. We're doing what we can do. So I think a child with dyslexia, it's really important to teach them to type and type fluently, and that can take a while. I encourage all my upper elementary school parents to try to work on that, because I think when a child can type, it helps lessen the executive functioning demand of writing, because after all, when we write, we think of what we want to say. We have to remember the mechanics. We have to remember the capitalization, punctuation, spacing, spelling, orthographic rules, all the things. And then if you can do that, and you still have to do all that with typing, but then that enables you to access things like spell check, or, computers can often point out areas. I mean, they do it for me all the time when I'm writing emails, where we can improve. And to me, I think that makes sense. That is something all of us do, grammar check, spell check, and that is helpful for students. I do have some students who really like voice to text, talking to the print or the computer and having. And that's fine. I think it depends on the purpose of the assignment. Like if the assignment is to write a 3-paragraph essay and that is a huge reach for that kid, by all means, voice to speech, that's it. Voice to speech. I'm mixing my terms, but I always say text to speech, and my kids are like,
speech,
no.
The text, that's it. Speech to text. That's fine. If the assignment is to write a paragraph and the focus is, what can the child do on the spot, then maybe that's not such a good approach to use. But I always encourage parents to think about what is the goal of the assignment. It's not hopefully to have it end in tears and torture and everyone's crying. So, use technology as needed to help with that. And then, obviously work with the school and the classroom teacher as much as possible. But if the teacher really needs a 3-paragraph essay, then by all means, use technology to help your child get that done if it's going to be a really stressful situation for them. And then pick and choose and, maybe do differently if the assignment is smaller or easier.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying is really accurate, which is that it depends. And so there's no answer. Yes, we should use it all the time, or no, we should never use it. It's kind of in the middle, and it just depends on the situation. And something I wish that people understood about dyslexia is that it's exhausting for them to read and write, for many of them to read and write. And the longer they do it, the more just exhausted they get. And so if you get a student with dyslexia and they write 2 sentences and they are just so exhausted and they refuse to move on, that's very common. And it's not laziness at all. It's that their brain has to work twice as hard, and it is just physically exhausting. So, and especially if they have dysgraphia, which goes along with dyslexia. So these are a lot of things that I always tell teachers to consider when they're evaluating students, when they're pre-assessing and writing, is that sometimes it's a motivational thing, but other times it's not. Sometimes it is dyslexia and dysgraphia. Mm-hmm. And so with the assistive technology, I think it's great, but we have to really work hard with kids to help them, because if you do speech to text, a lot of times sometimes it's good, but with the way kids talk, sometimes it's just one long run-on sentence. And so it's a good opportunity to sit down and teach them how to use it, but then to look at it and say, okay, let's read it back. Okay, that's not the word I meant. Let's fix that. We need to add punctuation there. So it's a good place for kids to start if they're overwhelmed, but then we have to teach them critically to look at it, which I think is essential even for kids without dyslexia, because we have so many kids who are using ChatGPT or any sort of other assisted technology, and they're not actually looking at the output to make sure it makes sense. They're just kind of randomly submitting things. And we do need to teach kids that, and adults too, that they need to actually look at that and use it as a starting point, but make sure that they're adding, to make sure it's accurate and it's conveying their thoughts properly and everything. Yeah. If there's not any minefields in what they're putting, since we know that there are some issues there. But I think, I think it's a great tool, but we need to know how to use it. So I know you talked about parents a lot, and I know you work with a lot of parents. How would you recommend parents really support their dyslexic children at home, especially those that don't have access to any sort of tutoring or help because they can't afford it, or they just don't have anybody in their area?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think the first step is, for many parents, there's that voice, something's not quite right. And I think many times well-intentioned people in the education field will try to say, no, just give them more time. Let's wait and see. There could be time for things to change. And I would say the very first step, if you hear that little voice that says, no, something is not right, request a school district evaluation, whether you're a homeschooler, whether your kid's in private school or public school. Typically the system works so that the local school district that you live in will provide a totally free evaluation, and you will just have more information about your child. It could ideally lead to maybe your child does qualify for an IEP and could get some more services through the school district. That would be amazing. That would be an ideal outcome. But at the very least, it will give you more information about how your child learns, their strengths and their weaknesses. And I think that every parent should have that if they have questions about their child's progress in school. I think if your child is reluctant to read and struggling with reading, audiobooks, they need to keep getting that vocabulary on grade level without necessarily the act of reading themselves. I work with students who are years behind where they should be, 10 years old, but reading at a kindergarten level. And so when you're working with a student like that, you really need to keep that vocab coming in, because unfortunately, they're going to read less than their peers. Their peers are continuing to read more and more and more. And then they're struggling and reading's really hard, so they're not doing it. And, in the Orton-Gillingham world, in the reading world, it's commonly called the Matthew effect. The kids that can do it are going to read and read more, make all this progress. And the kids who have dyslexia or just really struggle with reading aren't going to do as much, and they fall behind. So I think that is an easy thing that any parent could do. You can get audiobooks from your local library for free. There are all these apps, Libby and, things like that. I think that is something, if every parent did that for their struggling reader, I think that would make such a big difference. Some kids will let parents help them at home. Other kids will not. We definitely have a sizable portion of clients who have perfectly qualified Orton-Gillingham trained parents who are teachers, and their kid wants none of that. And they come to us for that help. But there are some really great UFly is a fantastic free phonics curriculum that you can Google and find. And if your child will let you, it has all the slides and the information is available for free. That is something you could do to sort of, if you see your child struggling with something, try to teach them yourself at home. But I think I'm a big believer, which is funny to say as the owner of a private tutoring practice, that every child should get the help they need at school at no cost to the parent. And I think the more you can start that evaluation process with your school, you never know what it'll turn up, and you never know what resources are there that someone might offer your child once you start having those conversations. So I certainly recommend that as a place to start.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think a lot of parents don't know, they don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know how to start that process. They don't know that you can access it even if your child doesn't go to that school.
Yeah.
And results may vary. It's definitely different from one district to the next. And sometimes you do need to advocate, but there are some great parent groups. If you search on Facebook for like dyslexia parent advocate, you'll see lots of groups come up, and they have ones for specific states sometimes. And a lot of times parents will ask, here's the situation. Here's what I've done so far. We haven't gotten anywhere with our district. What do we do next? And parents have lots of great advice of things they've done to help push that process through, and just advocate, because again, results may vary, and some districts are very overwhelmed. And so it can be hard to get it done in a timely manner. So, and I like that you said that you mentioned audiobooks for vocabulary, because decodables are fantastic for students with dyslexia who are learning the basics of phonics. But like you said, the vocabulary in those is very simplistic. And so audiobooks and even reading aloud, if you don't have the money to get a device to listen to an audiobook, you can play it on your phone if you have one, but even just reading aloud to your kids an on grade level book is so helpful. And I think a lot of parents stop doing that as their kids get older, because, you're used to reading aloud with picture books. But reading chapter books is something that we love as parents. I always read my favorite ones from when I taught, 4th and 5th grade to my kids. A little bit high. It's too high for them to read on their own, but, I'm here to read to them, and we have great discussions. And my husband reads one of his favorite books, which is absolutely not at children's level. So he has to edit things out. But we enjoy doing it. We enjoy the books, and the kids are learning these crazy vocabulary words. They're pulling them out like these wild vocabulary words. So It definitely works. There's a lot of research behind it. And it also enriches their writing. And they may not be able to spell some of these words quite yet, but when they're trying to use some of these words from their chapter books or their read-alouds, or, it's just really exciting to see that. A lot of times, again, you can't really tell what the word is, but they'll tell you what it is. And that's really how it starts, how they start incorporating really strong vocabulary into their writing. So I think that's a really good tip for teachers as well as parents, because we should not be getting rid of our read aloud time.
No, not at all. And decodable texts, they're like the training wheels. That's what kids should be using to read more. The goal is not to stay in decodable text forever, for sure. And again, if you are a classroom teacher and you have varied learning and decoding needs, like you said, a read aloud is your chance to get into story structure. It's your chance to get to this higher level, let's story map. Where's the client? What's happening here? And your struggling readers need that so much, because they're not able to go do that on their own. They're not necessarily able to decode that level of text. So it's vitally important. So I think it's, again, that's an easy thing that classroom teachers can do that benefits everybody. And if it's getting bumped because of time, maybe that's a nice prompt or reminder to make sure you bring it in, even if it's once a week, just to make sure that that discussion time happens, because it's so important for all your students.
Yeah, or even 10 minutes a day after recess, or even sometimes when you're teaching a new concept, your students don't have to be reading it on their own. You can use a read aloud to teach a new concept. So it's just a matter of fitting it in where you can. And just like with reading, where you can read something that obviously would be difficult for your students who are behind grade level to read and understand, you can read it aloud and use it, and they can participate just like the students who are on grade level or above grade level can participate. So it makes it more accessible for them. And whereas if you're using just, grade level text all the time, you're going to struggle with those kids. And it's the same with writing. We always model writing at a higher level than what our students actually produce, but they're seeing those skills in place, and then they're doing it at their own level. But, we don't want to prevent students from seeing quality writing just because they can't write, a full paragraph. We still want to model correct spelling, correct grammar, correct, we still want to model multi-paragraph essays when that's on grade level, even if they're not there yet. And then they're writing, a few sentences in one paragraph, and that's great. And some kids are writing the multi-paragraph. So it's just it's very similar in writing as reading.
You have to differentiate.
Yeah, always. Yeah. And then more natural it is, the better, because that makes it a lot easier planning wise.
Yeah.
So tell us how people can find you to learn more about supporting their students with learning disabilities. I know you have a great resource that you wanted to share.
Yeah, you can find me on most of the socials under New Paltz Multisensory Tutoring. That's the name of my tutoring practice. We're on Instagram. We're on Pinterest. I think I have a LinkedIn, although I don't do very much with that one. And we're on Facebook, again, under New Paltz Multisensory Tutoring. And Paltz is spelled Paltz. Speaking of word origin, it's Dutch, I believe. And yes, I have one of the things that I hear from teachers constantly is I have this student, and they're just not understanding the B and the D, and I've tried all the things. So we have a packet of resources for teachers and or tutors, whoever, parents. It'll work for anybody who's struggling with that just gives a little target of practice and hopefully some new ways to go about that, because that is actually a visual discrimination issue, because if we think about a B and a D and a P and a Q, it's really the same letter inverted all 4 ways. So we put together a resource packet for people to work with their child or their students to try to give a little targeted practice, because that is one of those things that if you work with kids with dyslexia, you hear, it's one of those struggles.
Yeah, it's very common. I'll link to that in the show notes, as well as spelling out your handle on social so people can find you. Because they're going to be typing in all sorts of things now. But yeah, everything will be in the show notes, and that way everybody can go and grab the resource that you talked about.
And I spend, I love engaging with people. I spend the most time on Instagram currently. So if you're on Instagram, come say hi, because, that is where... And that is where there really is starting to be lots of people talking about and saying and doing interesting things. So if, what we've talked about today is of interest, Instagram is a good place to hang out and poke around.
Yes, it definitely is. Well, thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge on this topic. I think it's so important for all teachers, parents, administrators, everyone that is working with children to know more about how we can support our dyslexic learners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite topics, clearly, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Heather.